right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today for Webinar Wednesday. We are excited to feature Quinn Nystrom, who's the Diabetes Ambassador for the Center for Change, which is headquartered here in Utah. For the past 23 years, Quinn Nystrom has been sharing her and her brother's stories of living with T1D to over 300,000 people across North America. She's a published author of the book, If I Kiss You, Will I Get Diabetes? So cute. And is a regular blogger for ontrackdiabetes.com. As a professional speaker, she travels to diabetes camps, convention halls, corporate offices, US Congress, and the White House. Her company, Q Speak, allows her to speak, write, consult, and raise funds for diabetes. So we are so excited to hear from Quinn today. If you are joining us on Facebook and you have questions that crop up during the presentation, feel free to post them in the comments. And if you are watching here on Zoom with us, feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A at the bottom, and we will capture those questions during the presentation. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Quinn, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. The great thing about Zoom and Facebook Live is we can be coming from wherever to join each other. And I can be joining you in Utah. I'm coming to you from central Minnesota. So I am going to share my screen so I can get started here. So just hold with me for 1 second so I can get my PowerPoint up. Okay, great. So thank you all for joining. This is a really important topic, not just because of the high prevalence between people with type 1 diabetes and eating disorders, but also the personal passion that I have for this topic, which I will share as we go into the presentation. And again, like Stacey said, please, make any comments or please ask any questions in the chat so that I do have time at the end where I will answer those. So my story starts with my younger brother. He was first diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 5 years old. This was back in 1996. My family really didn't know much about diabetes. My only knowledge of it was I was in the 5th grade, and all I knew about type 1 diabetes was Stacy from the Babysitter Club book series. I knew that I wanted to help my brother. I wanted to do anything I could to find a cure for diabetes. And I just wanted to help him out. That's all I really knew. And so here I was at 10, I started knocking on neighborhood doors, raising money for diabetes. I started going into classrooms and talking to people about what diabetes was, what it wasn't, because I saw that a lot of people were quite ignorant on what diabetes was. People were telling Will that he ate too much sugar. That's why he got diabetes. My parents didn't exercise him enough. I always thought, like, do people think he's like a hamster, right? And he needs to be on some meal. It was always so strange to me, all these comments that he got. So I always, really tried my hardest to go around to classrooms and educate people. When Will had been diagnosed, my parents asked the pediatrician at the time. I'm from a smaller town in central Minnesota, like I said, from Baxter, Minnesota. And my parents had asked the pediatrician, what is the likelihood that our 2 older children could get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes? And this pediatrician said, if that were to happen, your family would be on the cover of the New England Journal of Medicine. And so my parents really didn't think it was going to be a possibility that neither my brother Thor nor I would be diagnosed. Well, 2.5 years later, I was in the 7th grade. I was 13 years old. My mother, who had been the primary caretaker of Will with his type 1 diabetes, started noticing the classic signs and symptoms of a high blood sugar when she was around me. We were at a cross-country ski banquet. She noticed that I was drinking a lot of fruit punch, going to the water fountain, going to the restroom very frequently during this 3-hour-long banquet. And when we got home that night, she said, Quinn, I need you to test your blood sugar on Will's blood sugar machine. And of course, as a 13-year-old girl, I said, absolutely not. I am not interested. I do not have diabetes. But when my mom meant business, I knew I was going to be forced to do it. So I tested my blood sugar on Will's machine. Back then it was a 45-second countdown. Some of you will probably remember those days. And when it counted down, it did not say a number. All it said was 2 letters, HI. And I knew at that moment that this life that I had known was sort of over in the flash of this screen flash, and that my life wasn't going to sort of be free in this sense anymore, that it was going to be filled with doctor's visits and blood sugar checks and counting carbs and insulin injections, because I had seen my parents, take care of my younger brother for the last 2.5 years. And so I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I was very upset about it. I was 13 years old. I was a teenager. All I wanted to do was blend in with my friends. I wanted to look like my friends, act like my friends, talk like my friends, date the same guys that my friends did. The last thing I wanted was a chronic incurable illness where now I was going to be forced to go down to the nurse's office for a morning snack. I had to go down 20 minutes before lunch. I would have to go down before and after gym class to test my blood sugar, and then leave anytime I got a low blood sugar or felt like I had a high blood sugar. That wasn't the life that I wanted or ever dreamed of for myself. And so I was quite angry that first year. Now, a lot of you will probably sympathize with this. So this carefree life that I lived for 13 years was no longer. Now, I couldn't go to a movie. I couldn't go to a sleepover without having to pack all of this. My blood glucose meter, my test strips, my ketone strips, my lancing device, my CGM, sensor, alcohol swabs, the list goes on. My parents would have to call the parent for the sleepover before I went over. I'd have to call throughout the night with my blood sugar checks, what I was going to eat. And again, I think I was just really embarrassed, and I didn't know how to cope with the disease. And I didn't know how to reconcile sort of being myself and now living with type 1 diabetes. And so it was a real struggle for me. And I always show this because I actually find it very helpful. And I talk to a lot of healthcare professionals. So my professional job is actually being a professional speaker, traveling all around North America. And a majority of that is actually talking to healthcare professionals on how best to communicate to people with diabetes. And the biggest thing that I show people is this chart, because I think what's important is that healthcare professionals realize how difficult it is to manage a blood sugar. I think there's so many times that I know that I've been asked, like, why is your blood sugar 320, Quinn? And I just want to say, well, sometimes I know. And then sometimes I just want to hand them a copy of this chart and say, your guess is as good as mine. And, when Diatribe put this out, I was really relieved in a sense, like somebody got it and they were able to make a tangible chart out of it. And so I tell these healthcare professionals to print this out, to put it in their office, to show their patients they understand how difficult it is every single day for somebody with diabetes to write this, walk this tightrope and be juggling a bunch of things up in the air and just to try to make it across. And so the more empathy and sympathy and compassion that we can show people with diabetes, and also to teach ourselves, the better we're going to do. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint. This is not a thing of perfectionism that we are striving for. That just doesn't work with living with diabetes. There's nothing, people post their unicorn blood sugars all the time. If you do that, fine. I don't post a unicorn blood sugar. Sure. Have I had a blood sugar of 100? Yeah. Have I also had blood sugars way into the 400s? Yeah. Do you probably hear my CGM beeping right now? Yes, you do, because I have a low blood sugar. And so I'm trying to chug down 2 juice boxes right now. To me, that's the reality of living with type 1 diabetes. So anyways, I was really depressed for over a year. My parents put me in therapy. And then my mother came to me and said, I have this great idea, Quinn, that I think is really going to help you. Let's send you to this place that I heard about. It's a diabetes camp, and it's a place called Camp Needlepoint. And she said, I think you're going to love it. It's a really great place. You know, now I was 14 years old. You know, in Minnesota, our summer months are precious. We get like 2 good months of the whole entire year. And I was like, over my dead body, am I going to a place called Camp Needlepoint? I was like, this is social suicide. This is going to be terrible. I was like, I'm not going to come back with a t-shirt saying I went to Camp Needlepoint this summer. I had these dreams of like, you know, the staff wearing like white lab jackets and like walking around with hypodermic needles. And I was like, this is a terrible idea. I'm not going. And of course, her and my aunt packed my bags. I went kicking and screaming 4 hours to Hudson, Wisconsin to this camp. But the truth was that this camp, it was the first time that I had been around other girls my age who were living with type 1 diabetes, who had learned how to accept the terms of a disease that they did not ask for. And they had gotten on with their lives in a really beautiful way, not saying that they liked the terms of it, but they had figured out to make the disease a footnote in their life instead of a headline. And that's what I needed to learn. And I learned a really important lesson at this camp, that I didn't get the choice to get diabetes, but I got the choice on how I was going to react to getting diabetes. And that was a really powerful lesson to me, because my parents couldn't decide for me, friends, boyfriends, whoever couldn't decide for me. And my quality of life, I was the only one who was going to suffer by being as bitter as I could over this diagnosis. You know, I had a big life I wanted to live pre-diagnosis. I shouldn't let diabetes get me down. And so I left Camp Needlepoint and, you know, redoubled down on my commitment to wanting to help raise awareness about diabetes and raise funds for it. And really deciding that I was going to let diabetes be a footnote in my life. And so when I was 16 years old, I was chosen to be the National Youth Advocate, which led me to be the youth spokesperson in the country. So I traveled all around. I got invited to the White House, went around to all different diabetes camps speaking to people. And I realized I could be the small town girl and I could make a big impact by telling my story and other stories about the highs and lows of living with diabetes. I continued on. Like I told you, now I've made it a full-time career speaking all over North America on living with diabetes. Now, the other reality that I think is important to talk to people about is, what is the other reality that people with diabetes live with? Now, I will say I only ever like to talk for myself. So these are screenshots that I have taken either from social media or from magazines that I have found or from presentations that I have attended. Okay, so all right, so the one on the left, this was on a TV show, morning show. Sugar tax, sugary drinks, you know, increase diabetes risk irrespective of weight, right? Or complete your meal jug with a mega jug and KFC will donate $1 to JDRF. And then somebody thinks they're very clever, right? And says, buy a giant soda to help with diabetes research. And they think they're very funny because they're making the, you know, the insinuation that if you drink pop, that you'll get diabetes on both of these ads, right? And again, that's incorrect. This was the CrossFit CEO. This is a couple years ago. You might have seen this on Twitter. It blew up all over though, national media. This person said, make sure that this is the CEO, sorry. Make sure you pour some out for your dead homies, Greg Glassman. And he redid the Coke label to say open diabetes, okay? And what's really interesting is, you know, people in the diabetes community obviously were outraged by this. Nick Jonas was outraged by this. Greg Glassman and CrossFit never apologized, and they only doubled down on their commentary, saying that they were correct in making these comments. Okay. I don't know if you guys have ever seen these things. Believe it or not, use frozen lemons and say goodbye to diabetes, tumors, overweight. I think we can all relate. I know I can't see any of you on this call, but I pay a lot of money for this vial of insulin, right? That has increased in 1,200% in the last 20 years. If I could go out and get a couple frozen lemons to cure this disease, I think all of us on this call would be rushing out to buy, what, a couple dollar lemons to cure us. You know, I don't know the 11,000 people who interact with these types of posts. It's nonsense to me, right? I saw this at the grocery store recently, you know, diabetic living, what to eat with diabetes, cut carbs and calories, 7-day, 1,500 calorie meal plan, comfort food slim downs. Again, what I'm showing, this sort of obsession around food choices and cutting calories and cutting carbs, all around diabetes. You guys have probably seen this before. So Halle Berry once came out saying she had type 1 diabetes. Then she said because of her diet, she turned herself into a type 2. Then this last year, she came out and said, Halle Berry says the keto diet has helped her reverse her type 2 diabetes. Now, I hope everybody on this call knows there is no cure for type 1 or type 2 diabetes. You can manage your type 2 diabetes where you can get off medication, but medical doctors who are the smartest in this field, that is not curing or reversing type 2. You still have it. And so it's really dangerous when celebrities or people in power say this information because people believe it, right? Especially when she said her diet helped her go from a type 1 to a type 2. Again, very dangerous information to put out there. The one on the left, this is a couple years ago when it looked like the ACA was going to be repealed. There's an audio clip of this, but he was the White House budget chief at the time, Mick Mulvaney, and he said the White House says diabetics don't deserve health insurance. And what he said specifically was, why would the government pay to insure people through the ACA with diabetes? Because diabetics sit on the couch and are lazy and have caused their illness. This is not a political statement for me. What I'm saying is, if we have people who are in charge, Republican, Democrat, Independent, who believe this, and it's factually incorrect, right? We have some massive problems, okay? This is an MD here on our right on the custom footwear. He's a big time influencer, but an MD. Custom footwear for that special uncontrolled diabetic in your life. Again, who's ever been motivated by shaming and blaming somebody? Would we ever do this to somebody who's struggling with cancer, with liver failure, with lung disease? I don't believe we would, but somehow people with diabetes have become the sort of, the butt of the joke, unfortunately. This is an email I got, can bariatric surgery cure your diabetes? Yes, I understand they're referring to type 2, but no, you can't. And again, that perception, as a lot of you know, then people think that's type 1 diabetes too. So it fuels people's notion about how diet and exercise can somehow magically cure all of us. So I do a lot with insulin affordability. That's what I do in my free time. I've led a lot of efforts with that. That is a whole other presentation. If you want to contact me about it, you can. But I had done something for a video about it. Okay, so it's only about insulin affordability is what the video is about. Okay, the cost of insulin, trying to bring the cost of insulin down, that's it. So I was so excited. There were all these comments. I thought people were going to be so excited about the work we were doing. Instead, people write, it isn't a human right to expect others to take care of you when you're knowingly lived an unhealthy life. For most people, diabetes can be reversed, but it does take the effort and a medical system that's interested in doing the right things instead of just writing a script. This guy said, change your lifestyle and free from diabetes, naturopathic and yoga, only way. This guy said, losing weight and eating better will help. This person said, sue the food suppliers contributing to this health problem. Okay, this is just only a small snippet of these people. Okay, this is a screenshot that I took at a presentation where I was presenting after this person. This was a nutritionist speaking for a national nutrition company. Now, if we were together, I would ask you at this point, what do you think my problem with this slide is? And I would hope by now you are getting my point of what irks me on each one of these pictures or the messages. So I have no problem with them giving statistics, you know, about blindness, stroke, heart attack, loss of sensation, no problem educating people on that. My problem is the use of a photo of somebody almost naked with, you know, what, a big gulp or whatever they call that, and an overweight man. Because again, it's a very negative picture of people living with diabetes. And I have never met somebody with type 1 or type 2 that wants to have any list of one of those complications. What I find in all the travels meeting over 300,000 people is that people are working really, really hard, and that this is a really, really tough and complicated disease. And some people, frankly, just get burnt out. Some people have a lot of socioeconomic issues where they can't afford insulin, where they can't afford healthy food, where they don't have access to good medical care. That isn't being shown on this photo. And again, I understand a lot of this stuff is getting pointed for type 2. And, you know, I'm a type 1, my brother's type 1. I know everybody on this call is a type 1. But I think it's important, and I'll just say this for 2 seconds. But type 2s, yes, a contributing reason to getting type 2 can be obesity and lack of exercise and good nutrition. But there's 11 other contributing risk factors for a type 2 diagnosis. And I feel like the public doesn't understand that and shames them really bad. And it does not help anybody with type 1 diabetes because we all get put in the same boat. So I'll just say that can be for a whole other presentation as well that I do. But I think it's important to note that. And to just end my pictures, you know, on the top, this is diabetes. The bottom, this is not. So when people, you know, put their sugary Starbucks drinks and say, this is diabetes, you know, no, it's not, right? I think we all know what diabetes is, and it's a lot of hard work. And most people, it would be a major wake-up call if they had to live one day with type 1 diabetes. And I think we know that. You parents know that, caregivers, and the people living with type 1. It's very difficult. Okay, I'll take a deep breath because as you can see, I'm very passionate about this topic. So I wanted to show you that as sort of to set us up for eating disorders and diabetes. Why is there this high prevalence? Okay, so what is EDDMT1? Now, some of you may be more familiar with the term diabulimia. So the dual diagnosis of an eating disorder and type 1 diabetes is often referred to as diabulimia. However, it's not a medically recognized term, and it's really not a fully accurate description. So if you think about it, diabulimia refers to if a type 1 is omitting insulin and purposely having their blood sugars very high, and that's how they're losing weight. Okay, that's the eating disorder. That's the eating disorder symptom that they're doing. But if you think about it, people with type 1 diabetes, right, do a lot of different types of eating disorder symptoms, not just deciding to omit insulin. So they could restrict food, they could purge, not by just insulin omission, but they could purge by vomiting. They could use caffeine pills, laxatives. They could overexercise. And so that falls outside of this description of diabulimia. And so that's why a bunch of academics, people in the medical community came together and said, what is a better term to use that would cover all those people. And that's why they decided to term it ED for eating disorder, DMT1 for diabetes mellitus type 1. Now, again, neither of the terms, just so you know, are recognized in the DSM-5, which, as you know, is what psychologists use to make diagnoses. And in there is all the eating disorders that are used as well. So prevalence of eating disorders. We know that 75% of American women are dissatisfied with their appearance. 50% of 9-year-old girls and 80% of 10-year-old girls have dieted in America. At least 4% of teenage girls and college-age women become anorexic or bulimic. So here we turn to people with type 1. Eating disorder behavior is seen in 8% of type 1s versus 1% of their peers without type 1 diabetes. An increased risk of disturbed eating behavior in girls with type 1 diabetes as young as 9 years old. 32.4% of females with type 1 diabetes have some form of disordered eating or weight control behavior. 36% reported intentional omission of insulin out of that group. And there's a strong association between type 2 diabetes and clinically significant binge eating. That's just not sort of my area that I speak about, so that's why I'm not touching on it, but I do want to mention that in this presentation. So, people with type 1 diabetes, women, this has been shown in these studies, are 2.5 times more at risk for an eating disorder. And I think that is very surprising for so many people. It was very surprising for me because here I was the National Youth Advocate. I was going around to conferences, big diabetes conferences all over the country, and nobody was speaking about eating disorders. I wasn't hearing anybody talk about it. I would sometimes, sort of in the last several years, hear people talking about diabulimia, but I'd sort of think, oh, I don't omit insulin. That has nothing to do with me. So I would just be super dismissive about it. And it was always talked about almost as insulin omission, and then, oh, that's a non-compliant diabetic, right? Is that really an eating disorder, or is that just a diabetic who's not behaving correctly? And by the way, I hate the word non-compliant. I think that's terrible, but okay. So why is there this higher risk, you may ask? So this is all research-based. Feels betrayed by their body with the diagnosis of diabetes. So at 13 years old, I was pissed that I had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I thought, how did I ask for this? The emphasis on food and dietary restraint. So when I was 13, I was diagnosed, I was brought right to the nutritionist, and I was told, these are good foods, these are the bad foods, and here are the free foods. And then I was told at breakfast, between this 30-minute increment, you will eat 3 to 4 choices. You'll have 1 to 2 choices at your morning snack, half hour, and it was very, very regimented. And so you're sort of set up right out of the gate for this food and dietary restraint and labels put on your food. Society setting food rules for people with diabetes. So, let's all be honest. I have a full chapter in my book about this, the diabetes food police. I don't know somebody with diabetes who's not ran into those people. I still get it probably on a weekly basis. I don't care if I'm eating pasta. I don't care if I had a cookie. Sometimes even if I'm drinking a Diet Mountain Dew, somebody will say to me, are you sure you should be having that? And I'll always say, like, why? Is it yours? Because I just think it's so bizarre that somebody would ask me that question because they don't have diabetes and they typically never have a medical degree. So society, and again, just think of how somebody with type 1 would feel always getting these comments about their food and beverage intake. The diabetes management focused on numbers, so patients then judge themselves on good or bad. So good or bad food, good or bad blood sugar, good or bad A1C, good or bad weight. And so we then end up taking it very, very personal, right? Like it's about us and if we are a good or bad person, because we don't get a day off from type 1 diabetes. this belief from our society that you ate your way into diabetes. Yes, in our logical mind, we can say that's not true, but this perception from society, that's really hard to get away from. Weight gain or a higher BMI result from intensive insulin therapy. The temptation factor, so this is talking about if somebody would choose to do insulin omission. There's an easy availability of the deliberate insulin omission to control weight. The effect of diabetes on self-concept, body image, and family interactions. So this has been researched extensively. People with type 1 diabetes are more conscious of their body because they're having to, pinch their skin all the time to give themselves insulin injections. If they have a CGM, a pump, much more than a peer their age that doesn't have diabetes. And so how does that really affect them? Also wearing devices, how does that affect, their self-concept on themselves and their body image? Also, lastly, family dynamics involving the autonomy and independence concerning diabetes self-management. This plays a big factor. I know an old friend who, to give an example, she was testing her blood sugar. Her dad was looking over her shoulder. She had a high blood sugar. I don't remember what it was, 200s or 300s. And he was so furious that he took that blood sugar machine and he tossed it as hard as he could, to whatever wall they were in. And he smashed that machine in smithereens. Okay. She was so fearful of seeing what that blood sugar was going to be. She went 2 years after moving out of the house without testing her blood sugar because she was so frightened. Now, I'm not blaming the father or whatever, but what I'm saying is it clearly had a massive impact on her. And I also believe that father, he was letting fear for his daughter and her well-being take over him, right? So making sure that family and their concerns are being addressed, if that's going to family therapy, if that's going to individual therapy, but making sure that doesn't seep out in different ways. Center for Change has done some incredible research. Again, there's not a huge wealth of research on this specific topic, especially research of people in residential and inpatient treatment centers in the United States specifically. So Jenica Beagley, who leads the diabetes team at Center for Change, because they specialize in the treatment of this, she has spearheaded a research project. And so what they did is they reviewed the charts of the past 27 patients with type 1 diabetes who were admitted to 24-hour care at Center for Change, so the most acute patients. They analyzed the DEPSAR, which is something where they, assess people when they're coming in. They looked at their hemoglobin A1C. And what they wanted to see was, are these patients primarily omitting insulin, or are there other symptoms that they're using? Because again, I think there's been this thought process in the diabetes community that if you have an eating disorder, it must be insulin omission, because that is really what's dominated the conversation for so long, and also in the media. So what they found was 41% of their patients who were admitted never had omitted insulin, ever. Now, 26% had said that they always omit insulin. So again, there is a group of people who do that, absolutely. And then you saw a mix here in the middle of people sometimes doing it, often, usually. But what is so important about this is showing people that, again, there is a full spectrum of eating disorder symptoms that people with type 1 diabetes do use. And that plays out in their eating disorder in different ways. Also, people, their average A1Cs, so obviously you would see double-digit A1Cs with people who omit insulin. But I think it's also important to note that people who never omit insulin, we know that we should have our A1Cs, they say with research underneath 7.0. Well, you can see people who never omit insulin, their average A1C is still over 8%. So they're still struggling to really get their A1C in that healthy range. And so things still have to be addressed with them. And obviously it would be tough to manage your blood sugar well while you are deep in an eating disorder, no matter what those symptoms are. So you want to send somebody who's struggling with this to a place that also understands the diabetes part of it, just as well as they understand the eating disorder part of it. Also, I thought this was fascinating. Fascinating. You can let me know if you find it fascinating. But one of the DEPSAR questions is, do you feel fat when you take all of your insulin? Okay. And what was really interesting is here are the people, 0 if they've never omitted insulin, 5 is, you've always omitted insulin. And you can see the always, yes, they have a very high average score for that they feel fat when they take all their insulin. But what's really stuck out to me is if you go to the 0 never category, they had just as high of scores. So just because you're not omitting your insulin doesn't mean that taking your insulin doesn't trigger other symptoms. And so I think that's really important to know that it can still be a trigger for people struggling with an eating disorder. And so you may say, well, Quinn, why are you so passionate about this topic? I've done this presentation probably over 100 times, and you'll hear from people who've listened to me that many times, I'm still just as passionate. And the reason why is because for years, I was struggling with an eating disorder in silence. I struggled since my teenage years with an eating disorder. Actually, my pediatrician, the year before I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, my parents had brought me in. I was a competitive figure skater. They had heard from the school nurse that I was struggling to eat, any type of meals. So my parents brought me to the pediatrician. He had told my parents, she's probably anorexic. Make sure that you're watching her and she's eating her meals. Well, that was sort of like a free pass, right? I mean, they kind of monitored me, but they didn't know much about it. I came from a small town. There wasn't any support for people with eating disorders. And then I went on my merry way. Then I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes shortly, less than a year later. And I think my mom just thought getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes would kind of clear things up. Like now I was on this kind of strict regimen. But unfortunately, what it turned into for me was sort of classic vintage bulimia, where I was purging by vomiting, using laxatives, using caffeine pills. I was a competitive figure skater. I was trying to figure out ways to manage my weight now that I had type 1 diabetes. And why I'm so passionate about it is I struggled until I was 24 years old with an eating disorder until I was ever asked one question about if I was struggling with an eating disorder. I went to some of the best diabetes specialists in the world. Nobody once asked me a question other than if I omitted insulin. And because I was sort of a typical weight, I wasn't flagged because I wasn't underweight. Okay, and we know now, most people actually who have eating disorders, they're not underweight. That's actually a very small percentage of people with eating disorders are underweight, people with anorexia. So nobody flagged me for that. And nobody flagged me because I didn't have a double-digit A1C, which is a real red flag for insulin omission. And so it wasn't until I met with an OBGYN who started to ask me some hard-hitting questions that's when I kind of broke down and finally admitted it. And so she got me into a treatment program at the age of 24 after struggling for 12 years. And that's why I'm so passionate about talking to other people in the diabetes community about how we have to talk about this, that there is such a higher prevalence, that not talking about this is not the solution here. We need to have information available to people so that we can better educate people on this, that we're better able to screen people. That's why I talk to healthcare professionals about this specific topic. And I was an outpatient, then I went into inpatient, then I went back out to outpatient, then I went back into inpatient, I went to residential, and that's kind of a typical journey. But I'm so grateful to say you can get to recovery, and recovery is possible. And I find that I actively choose recovery every single day of my life. And that's so important to me. So um, I always like to give some positive social media resources, because I know I share some really negative social media resources in the beginning of my presentation, but I really love body positive things on social media. So this is on Instagram. This is Body Positivities. I just really love her. I actually don't know her at all. I just came across her. She has type 1. So like this is one of her posts, treat the hypo, destroy the guilt. I think there's a lot of people, we feel very guilty after treating a low blood sugar. I will say, like, this is maybe PG-13R. Sometimes there are swear words in there. So if you have a young kid and are worried about that, you know, she will say sometimes an F-bomb. You know, recovery from an eating disorder cannot be achieved through more dieting or restriction, but it's just really positive things. Another person is Lauren Newman. Her Instagram is Go Feed Yourself. She has a lot of positive things. How does type 1 diabetes affect relationships with food? Again, because I think there's so much negative information out there, it's important to have our minds with positive factual information that I appreciate. 5 best communication tips when talking to somebody who may be struggling. Listen, you know, somebody feels isolated, they're misunderstood, they need a safe outlet. 2, no judgment. You know, if somebody comes to you saying they've been struggling with this, you know, not looking shocked, never scolding them. There's such a high burnout with this. And trying to stay away from those good and bad labels. Motivate, you know, what really motivates that individual. You know, typically it's not diabetes related, or it's not eating disorder recovery related. It's usually something about their hobby, their interest, their passion, future aspirations, is what research has found that really motivates an individual. Number 4, use humor when appropriate. You know, I found healthcare professionals and loved ones who really, you know, when things looked really bleak for me, they were able to really brighten my spirits by using some of those ridiculous things that society was saying, and we were able to turn them around and really just be able to laugh at it for what it was. 5, coach, right? Preaching rather than suggesting rather than preaching, and helping somebody give the power of perspective, I think, is really important. For family and friends, practical applications. So knowing the warning signs of eating disorder, of an eating disorder, and the symptoms of diabetes ketoacidosis. So if somebody is really sick and using insulin omission, having family and friends know about that, and also the person with diabetes. Refrain from fear tactics and shaming. Again, that can never motivate anybody. End body talk, right? I think we're seeing this all the time on social media now, like with Adele, for example. People are making this big deal that she lost weight and now they're calling her beautiful. Well, first of all, she was beautiful before, right? And what are we saying as a society? What? Now she loses a bunch of weight and now she can be beautiful, and now she's important. What is that saying to our young people in our culture, right? I think people can be beautiful at every size. And also, we don't know, and I'm not making any accusations at Adele, but like, what are we saying? Like, we don't know what anybody's individual journey is. And so, again, I think when we stop talking about people's body, their appearance, right, and focus on attributes about them. Are they kind? Are they funny? Are they smart? Those are the types of compliments and comments that we should be focusing on. Also, encourage flexible eating, right? Somebody with type 1 diabetes, they can have a cookie. You know, I always say, like, sure, I shouldn't have a dozen cookies in one sitting, but like, neither should my husband, who has a well-working pancreas, right? And so if somebody tells me, though, I can't have a cookie, I'm going to probably now eat a dozen cookies because I'm going to protest that somebody's trying to ban me from eating that cookie. And so I think encouraging that flexible eating. Also, I'll just say with ending the body talk, ending the food talk. Because, and that was something I really had to educate my family on. They didn't understand that that was so harmful. But like Thanksgiving, all that, you know, not making comments like, oh, I'm so full. Oh, I'm going to have to go and throw up after this. And I don't even think it was comments they thought that were hurting me. But if somebody's struggling with an eating disorder or disordered eating, that is really going to affect them in a totally different way when they hear that. So really learning that as a family to support the individual who's struggling. And so that's what I have for the presentation, and I would love to take anybody's questions or comments that we got during the presentation.
We had quite a few actually. So
Great.
first of all, I just want to say for number one, I thought Adele was gorgeous
Yes.
as a plus size woman. She was beautiful and radiated positivity to me. So I was very strange when I saw these pictures of her having lost weight. I was like, what the heck? Mindy Hooley says, hi, Quinn from Utah.
Oh, hi, Mindy.
Chapter leader.
Yes.
And I had a few questions that came in via my text messaging as well. So where would you say the line between normal teenage concern about their body and dangerous thinking falls?
So again, I'll give the caveat that I'm not a medical professional. My master's degree is in communication management. So I will put that out there. You know, if you're really concerned, you can always call Center for Change and they will give you a free consult. So I will put that out there because those are medical professionals who know this. But again, my personal opinion as somebody who has struggled, and I'll say this as in, you know, my younger brother and I, we grew up in the same exact family. We both had type 1 diabetes. He obviously never struggled with disordered eating or anything like that. I think where the line is, and obviously me growing up with a lot of other teenage girls who my friends didn't have disordered eating, but would talk body talk, diets, whatever. You know, a lot of my girlfriends would talk about their appearance or being pretty or, you know, making sure they looked good or, you know, sometimes I think just maybe because of peer pressure, they would talk about like being on a diet or whatever, but they were fine with having flexible eating. So there would be no problem if we would go to a friend's house for a sleepover and it was hot dogs and Doritos, let's say. For me, as somebody who is really struggling, I can't do that type of flexibility. Like where I think it becomes dangerous is somebody, because you become so rigid. You know, I had set myself up like with this saltine cracker diet and like diet 7-Up. And so I started socially isolating myself where I would turn down those invites. I didn't want to leave the house because I knew that I would be given those options. And I knew sort of my excuses at some point were going to run out. And so I think you have to look at how does it socially impact somebody? Are they becoming more isolated in their life? Are they becoming more lonely? Are they seeming more depressed? Are they withdrawing more from their social circles? Do they seem more rigid in what they're eating? Are they oftentimes sort of a sign can be if they're playing with their food, right? And it looks like they're eating because they're kind of, you know, moving around their food, but they're really not eating that much. And so I think that's where the line is, because I think a lot of teenage girls, frankly, just because it's the topic of conversation, which seems so boring now as adults, they just talk about their appearance or being on a silly diet or what size jeans they're in. And I think that's just the age. But I think those are the things where it gets into a danger zone.
Thank you. We do have Becky. It says, I'm a dietitian who has type 1 and work with patients with all types of eating disorders. Do you know of any studies that look at how we talk about food influencing the risk for developing disordered eating?
That's a great question. I can email Jenica Beagley, who's the lead for the diabetes and eating disorder team at Center for Change, and ask her. So if you just email me her information, I can follow up with her after this and ask that if there has been a specific read there.
For sure. I would love to connect you. Okay, here's a good one. What is the difference between dysfunctional eating and eating disorder?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think somebody who has disordered eating, maybe every so often they may have some food rules that they implement in their lives. But with somebody with an eating disorder, it has completely taken over their life. It has completely taken control. Somebody with disordered eating, it would almost look like, I think, like a extreme diet, like taken a little too far. Somebody with an eating disorder, it has almost completely impacted all aspects of their life. So again, like I told you, in my 20s, I was working, as a professional in Minneapolis. I would no longer go out for any social events. I had tied a very small bathing suit, I don't know why I did this, to my refrigerator to try to stop myself from ever grabbing any food in the kitchen. I put a padlock on the cabinet doors trying to stop myself before I would get something. It had really sort of clicked up a couple locks. I would not go out with friends for drinks because alcohol had too many calories in it. I would make plans with people and then cancel at the last minute because I just knew my excuses wouldn't work in person. And then I had this very strict and regimented eating plan. And then let's say I had a low blood sugar. That was a very big trigger for me. I would then oftentimes binge, unfortunately. That was just sort of my eating disorder. And then I would feel such guilt and shame over that then I would just go to the far opposite side and I would purge and then restrict eating for multiple days after. And so it's sort of hard to distinguish the two, but what I would say is when it really is impacting every single day of your life and your relationships, that's when it goes into a full-fledged eating disorder. And also when it's starting to have health impacts on your life and you continue it anyways. It's almost like when they say you have an addiction to drugs or alcohol and it's done a negative impact and you continue to drink anyways. It's similar with an eating disorder. So it's bad for you. I knew I had a heart condition at the time and I continued to do it anyways. I knew purging was bad for me. I was smart. I continued to do it anyways. So that's where I would distinguish the two.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying. Is it a control issue with people with type 1, just like it is with normal people? The mentality of developing an eating disorder when you don't have type 1 has a lot to do with control, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I think an eating disorder for a lot of people, we've often heard from people maybe who don't know as much about eating disorders, they always think it's about the weight, right? They think it's about losing weight. It often has nothing to do with the weight. Absolutely nothing to do with the weight. It has to do with, I feel like in my case as well, a sense of control. I felt very out of control with getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. That was out of my control. in the graph in the slide that it shows why are we at a higher risk, I related to almost every single one of those, right? Feeling betrayed, feeling societal rules. So like, for example, when people would ask me questions, even like, are you a type 1 or a type 2? I would be offended and feel like now I need to lose even more weight because I don't want people to think that I even have type 2, because I assume that was them saying I'm overweight because of the societal perceptions. And that's bad for me to say, but that's what I believe people were saying. Or if somebody said something about my food comments, it would make me then always just have salad or water when I was out in public, right? It fueled my eating disorder. And so it does become a control thing. And you're not even thinking about the weight oftentimes. You're thinking about how you can feel control and control your life and your choices.
Okay. One more. So with a disease that's so food centered, where your entire life is revolving around food and numbers, do you have any advice for making it not such a big deal to help lend better to less of a risk developing type 1 or developing an eating disorder?
So what I would say is, and again, I know like when I was diagnosed, it was back in the late 90s. And so a lot of the training back then for healthcare professionals was this really good, bad, free food model. It was choices at these certain times. But I think what's really great is now we're living in a time with new technology, new insulins, a new way that we look at carbs and how we eat them. And I think what's important is if we can use and be really specific on language and communication that we use. And again, staying away from body talk, trying to stay as far away as we can from food talk. And again, still doing education about, obviously we all have to be, expert wizards on carb counting, but making sure that somebody with diabetes is understanding that it's an all food fit model. Because again, I think anybody on the whole entire universe, because I've talked to a lot of people about this, if they are being told they can't eat something, they want to eat it more. And so, I think it really sets you up for failure and for a lot of these sort of resentful feelings when you're told you can't have something. And oftentimes I think people probably won't even have it. They just want to know it's a choice. So I think if we can do that, I think also it's really interesting. When I first started talking about this topic of eating disorders and type 1 diabetes, some people were nervous in the diabetes community. I actually got pulled off as the keynote speaker at some events, which may sound shocking because people thought it was too risque for me to talk about it. They thought I was going to give people ideas about what to do. And I think, again, we've learned with suicide, right, through research, that just because we talk about suicide does not increase people's chances for committing suicide. It actually reduces them. And so I think in the diabetes community, we have to be really honest with ourselves and say, this is something that we should not be avoiding. This is something that we should be talking about with people and talking about how dangerous it is for your health, for your mental well-being, if you have an eating disorder. And again, if you can catch an eating disorder earlier on and get the help and the treatment that is out there and available to you, you have a much better chance to recover. Instead of us trying to shame people about it, thinking it's a compliance issue, let's kind of sweep it under, the table, like, oh, my child would never have that. To really have an open dialogue about it, to me, is how we are going to best combat this, to reduce the numbers of it, is by having an open dialogue about it.
Well, that was a great presentation. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think we've reached the end of our questions. You covered pretty much everything else that I was asked in advance, so that was great. But I just want to say thank you so much from our chapter of JDRF and from our lovely state of Utah and Idaho. Hopefully our attendees found your presentation as valuable as I did. I really appreciate it. We will be back for Webinar Wednesday, not next week, but the following week. We'll be talking about psychosocial aspects of type 1 diabetes, which should also be another fantastic presentation. Here's Quinn's information on our screen, so if you'd like to get in touch with her, feel free to reach out. And thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Quinn.
Thank you so much, everybody.